know we say this every time, but you know, I know how busy we all are, and I really, truly, and all of us at the Air Force really appreciate people being dedicated to this project and coming to our public meetings and spending time that you could be at home or something else, you know, with your kids or whatever, and you come here because you care so much about your community, and we really do appreciate that. My name is Kate Linus. I'm the senior advisor for this project for the bulk fuels facility cleanup for the Air Force. And we're going to have a number of presenters tonight, and I'll let them introduce themselves. But the topics that we're going to cover tonight are our standard sort of update on where we've been, you know, where we've been since the last time we had a public meeting, which was actually our July open house, which is a little less formal than this. And we're going to give you an update on that, and we're going to talk about the plume maps, which I saw a lot of you looking out there, and how our interim measure is working, and some really impressive success so far that we're very excited about. And then we're also going to share with you the results of the coring work that we did. I know last year you saw our rigs out there, and we're out in Bullhead Park, and you can see them on the base. Well, we're drilling continuous cores down to the water table, and we're going to share with you the results of that, which are also really positive and really interesting. And then, because I like regulatory stuff, and I've been getting a lot of questions about it lately, I'm going to start to talk a little bit over the next few public meetings about the regulatory process that we're subject to, so you have a better idea of what the roadmap is as we transition in the not too distant future, hopefully, from the investigation stage to the remedy evaluation stage, which is called the corrective measures evaluation. I wanted to take this opportunity to introduce Colonel Alvarez. He's our Mission Support Group Commander. And I'd also like to introduce Stephanie Stringer from NMED. She's the Resource Protection Division Director. Is that the right title? And would you like to just introduce yourself and say a few words, or not? Yeah, I'm sorry, yeah. To kick things off.
Sure, thank you, Kate. So yes, my name is Stephanie Stringer. I'm the New Mexico Environment Department's Resource Protection Division Director. I took this position in March of this year. At our department, it's the Hazardous Waste Bureau that is kind of the main implementing bureau for this project. In the previous administration, it was handled in a different section of the department, but this is really a RCRA process that's driving this. This is the regulatory mechanism. And so we really put it back into the Hazardous Waste Bureau, very familiar with the Resource Conservation Recovery Act requirements, and that's the mechanism that we're following to get to that final endpoint, which is final remedy. Excuse me. We did just have our Hazardous Waste Bureau, John Keeling, who's been very involved in the project historically, retired. And so we're having staff turnover, and so we're coming up to speed and catching up on a lot of the document reviews. But certainly any questions that anyone ever has, you're welcome to give the department a call, and we'll try to get the information to you as quickly as possible. We're engaged very heavily with the Air Force because we all want this to be cleaned up as expeditiously as possible. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Kate.
So the NMED, this, oddly enough, because they are undergoing some transitions and new staffing and getting up to speed, they didn't have a presentation this evening, but I'm sure that they will at our next public meeting in April. And we also have a lot of technical information to share tonight, so I think, you know, it probably works out well. We can definitely hog all the time. So, and I also wanted to, with the transition to the Hazardous Waste Bureau away from the chief scientist, I just wanted to take this opportunity, he's not here tonight, but to thank Dennis McQuillan from the chief scientist for NMED for all the hard work on this project. You know, I'm sure everyone who's been following this really appreciates everything that Dennis did. And I know he's still going to have an advisory role as I understand it, but he's not going to be as in day-to-day. And I look forward to working with the team at the Hazardous Waste Bureau, many of whom I know because a long time ago I worked there too. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Scott, and he's going to do an update on just some of the general stuff we got going on with our pilots, as well as the amazing progress on the pump and treat for the ethylene dibromide plume. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Scott.
So thanks, everyone. Or thanks, Kate. So the first thing, is this too loud? I'm kind of, Okay, cool. I'll hold it down here. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the bioventing pilot test. So we've talked a little bit about this in the past, and so it's currently underway. So this has to do generally with the soil vapor that is in the ground from surface level to groundwater. It's called the vadosone. So there is, we had done quite a bit of what's called soil vapor extraction. Basically, you vacuum up and burn off the vapors in there. So we did that for about 12 years, and we started to see diminishing returns, which is exactly what you would expect after pumping on it for a while. And so we turned it off. We did what's called a rebound test and realized with that rebound test that there wasn't very much oxygen or humidity down there. So the bacteria that are native in the soils were unhappy, and so it made the decision to go ahead and go with it's called bioventing, and it was a pilot test. So with this, what we were going to do is just inject a little bit of oxygen and a little bit of moisture into the groundwater. And so let's see, we kicked this thing off. We first started the respiratory stuff, or respirometry testing, in April of this year, and so we just turned the bioventing system on in the beginning of October. And we have a report due to NMED on January 31st, 2020. They'll kind of roll up some of the results from what we found. We will continue, even though we turned the report on, we're not going to turn the bioventing system off. It's in the ground, and so we're going to continue running that through 2020 to 2021. And so the bioventing, like I said, here you have this in your slides, but it's an effective technology for fuel hydrocarbon remediation. Generally, the idea, like I said, is injecting oxygen and injecting a little bit of moisture. And this isn't like high level. It's not like one of those things that you've seen at used car lots or whatever. It's very low level of oxygen and just air that we're injecting down in there. And so what we'll be looking for are, byproducts of bacterial respiration. So we haven't seen any results yet. We just turned the thing on, but I'm sure at some meeting here in the future, we will be briefing on that and letting you know how that went. So, and with respect to the soil vapor extraction, with 12 years, it was something 750,000 gallon equivalent fuel from the vadosone, which are those soils that we pulled out of the ground by doing soil vapor extraction. And so I'm also going to provide an update on the groundwater treatment system. I'm sure a lot of you guys saw the slides out there. So we have 2 treatment trains up and running. So the treatment system, I don't know if anybody had come out to the open house that we had back in July, but we have 2 treatment trains. So they're parallel trains. Basically, we have the same system paralleled twice in the building. Each one of those has 40,000 pounds worth of carbon. And yeah, we have other pictures of it later. But so it's not an, yeah, it's actually, we have 2 treatment processes. So it's not an actual train. Yeah, it's a process line. Thank you. So yeah. Hmm? Sure. So we have 284 soil vapor monitoring points out there. So it's on base. It's on base, all in the area right there where the fuel spill happened. Yeah, so it's all generally directly in that area. And all around. So we monitor all those things regularly. No, that's the area where we implemented. We put in some new wells for the bioventing, and that's where all of that stuff is. All around it. Yeah, it's peppered with them. There's a lot of them all through there. And so, yeah, with the groundwater, so as of Monday, we were at 757 million gallons. It's pumped. The system's pumping away right now as I speak. So we have that going on. So the EDB plume, we've talked some about this in the past. I'll go ahead and do the quick refresher, but it doesn't show up very well on this. But you can see in Q2 of 2015, that's what the plume looked like. And the reason it's shaped that direction, or that shape, is what we put in. We've got 162 groundwater monitoring wells, and early on when we did that, you put a well in and you look at the lithology, which is the nature of the soils. And so we brought a bunch of brainy, like PhD geologists and all these guys in, and we looked at that stuff and realized that there's a channel right through here of coarser grained soils. And, they determined that it was an ancestral Rio Grande channel that's 500 feet below ground. And this is actually a preferential flow channel. So city drinking water wells are up here, like off the map, but they were creating a hydraulic gradient, and they were pulling that stuff, which is why in 2015, it was basically all hands on deck. Like, we need to figure out what's going on, or we need to figure out what we're going to do about this before it ever hits a city drinking water well. So, we realized if it's that shape and we have this, preferential flow channel, the idea generally is to put wells right down the middle of the plume. And if you put them down the middle of the plume, you get it to collapse in on itself. And that was the idea. You don't want to put wells, say, like on the outside or around, to draw dirty water across clean water. So we put them right down the middle to collapse it in on itself. And so first well went in 2015. Right now we have 4 extraction wells in the ground. And so you can see over time, it's really shrunk. And it was right around 2017 is when we started to see it move a little bit faster, because the city water conservation efforts, we've seen the groundwater generally flatten, and the city isn't pumping from those wells that are up here anymore. And so it's good news for us, because the water table pretty much flattened, and our extraction wells aren't having to compete with the northerly flow or any of these other wells. So our stuff started to work a little bit more efficiently is kind of what it looks like. And so that's what it looked like in Q2 2015. And this is what it looks like now in Q2 of 2019. I'll go to the next map because this is a better descriptor. So just for reference, that right there is Gibson, and that is Ridgecrest, and I think that's roughly Catherine is right around in there. And so, yeah, 2015 compared to 2019. And so, I've heard rumors, obviously we hear stuff that this is the first quarter that we have seen where we haven't seen anything really north of Gibson. That just like little bit right there. But this is the first time that well 2, 3, 4, and then the wells around it, we haven't seen anything. And so there's no plans to turn the system off. Why would we? We're going to continue running it. Our goal is to kill this plume. And so and the infrastructure's in the ground. At this point, it's just O&M. It's fairly cheap. The system's in the ground. We're going to continue pumping on this thing, and we're going to, make sure that, the city drinking water wells, I will say, without question, city drinking water wells have never been hit. They're never going to get hit. We're confident in that. And so we will continue to pump on this thing. And hopefully we're going to continue to see, yeah, sure. Pete? Bernie will probably talk some more about that, but it's a different, what we're attacking here is the ethylene dibromide. Ethylene dibromide, we talked a little bit, we have, and so it's one of those, it's kind of a bad player. It's water soluble, so it dissolves in water. It doesn't readily biodegrade. Yeah. So the idea with that one, we don't want, this well right here is pumping at 75 gallons per minute. These others are about 150 to 160 based on what the aquifer lets them pump. And so the answer to that is, not right now. We will evaluate that stuff in the corrective measures evaluation. This part of this of this interim measures was designed to get that mobile EDB that was moving to the north. And so, yeah.
Excuse me, we are recording this, and that's why we're doing questions at the end, so people can come to the microphone, and everyone can hear your questions, and it will be on the video. And I apologize, I know we're a smaller group, and it's easier to ask questions during the presentation, but it makes it very difficult, and the people who will watch this video will not hear your questions. So please save your questions for the end, and then come up to the mic. Sorry, Scott.
No, that's fine, thank you. And so, yeah, so I've heard it. There's no plans to shut this thing off. We're going to continue pumping for a long time. And so, so we have, this is probably just what I said. We have 4 extraction wells that have been pumping as part of the interim measure. Yeah, and the plume map that we're showing is based on the actual monitoring data. So we monitor all those wells. We have 162 of them on a very regular basis. And so the wells are screened at varying depths too. So we delineate not only the lateral extent, but also the vertical extent. We really don't see it any deeper than maybe 30 or 40 feet. You go down, all of this stuff is lighter than water, so it all floats. So we're not seeing anything sinking or going down. But we've had to put some more wells in to kind of chase it upwards with the rise in the water table. But you know what, if that's what we're okay with that. So yeah, and like I said, again, pumping will continue, and there are no plans to shut off the pump and treat system. So next up is Bernie Baukish with EA. He's one of our contractors, and he's going to be talking about the coring work and the source area characterization. So, Bernie.
Yeah, I'm going to need that. Hi, I'm Bernie Bacchus. I'm with EA Engineering. I'm their project manager for EA. Can you hear? Is that better? Okay. So the purpose of our source area characterization was we wanted to gather some additional data. So we wanted to know where we call LNAPL, light non-aqueous phase liquid, was. And LNAPL is really just a fancy word for fuel. Light meaning it floats, and non-aqueous phase liquid means it's not water. So when I use the term LNAPL, that's what I'm referring to as fuel. So we were trying to find out where was it in the soil, where was it in the groundwater, and as well as dissolved constituents, where there are additional dissolved constituents in the soil, and try to fill some of the gaps that we have in some of our groundwater monitoring. And then all of this data that we're collecting is going to be used to come up with, or it's going to inform the corrective measures evaluation, which means we're going to use it to try and figure out how to clean this up. So we installed 11 coring locations. So we drilled 11 boreholes, and we cored those. Some of them were cored basically from ground surface all the way to the total depth, which was about 515 feet, so pretty deep. Some of them, we knew there wasn't contaminants in the surface soil, so we ended up just drilling down to that point because coring takes a lot of time. The soil cores that we collected, we tried to get as good an integrity of the sample as we could. So we did a lot of kind of things that might seem crazy. We wanted to make sure that the temperature of the soil did not exceed basically what the background temperature was, to make sure that since we're looking for fuels, that it didn't volatilize, that we were losing some of those contaminants in the soils. So the drilling method that we use is sonic, and sonic can create heat when it drills. So we were doing things like freezing the barrels with dry ice to keep the temperatures down, and then we would check the temperature of the soil here to make sure that it was within our specific parameters. The soil samples were put in a refrigerated box truck to make sure that they kept cold so that the sample integrity would be maintained. And throughout our process, we collected data. We photographed the soil so that we have a running log of what it looked like to get an idea of what the texture was. And then we logged the soil, so we basically described the changes in sands and clays and where those contacts were. And then we collected samples and sent them to the lab. Oh boy, that doesn't look so good, does it? So this shows where we installed the borings, and we installed a total of 9 borings were converted to monitoring wells. 2 were converted to soil vapor extraction monitoring wells. The 2 soil vapor monitoring wells are up here in the source area. So the source area is where the release occurred, and the vapor monitoring wells were installed a little bit shallower at about 275 feet, and we're using those to monitor, collect data for the bioventing test that we just talked about, or that Scott talked about. And then the monitoring wells we installed kind of adjacent to the source area, and then this kind of follows the trend of what we're seeing in the groundwater. So we wanted to see, was there LNAPL, was there fuel still underneath the groundwater table that was causing dissolved concentrations. So that's why we installed the wells where they were. Oh, and then, I'm sorry, we also installed one well, this one down here, that's a background well, and we installed it in a clean area so that we could compare the different soil constituents in the clean area versus impacted area. So this is just a kind of some of the data that we collected, and I'm just going to go through the reasons why we collected. So we we log the soil. We call them lithologic logs. So we know where the clays are, where the sands are, and that's important because where sands are, the fuels will tend to move faster. Where clays are, they'll tend to move slower. So that helps us give us an idea of how things move through the subsurface. We collected samples that talk about that gave us an idea of how much elnapple is in the soil, as well as can it move. So will it move laterally? Will it move from its position down gradient? We also collected samples that gave us information on bacteria, whether there's bacteria in the soil that will help degrade things, as well as are there certain minerals in the soil that will help degrade some of the contaminants. So we collected, we ran about 350 different analyses from all the samples that we collected. And then from that data, we put together a model. So we put together a computer model that gives us an idea of where the soils are in relationship to, and what types of soils there are in relationship to where the contaminants are. And it was very interesting when we did this. You can kind of see the upper portion, upper 160 feet, is primarily clays, and they tend to be less permeable. And then the rest, this area here that's all in the white, they're sands and gravels. They tend to be more permeable, so it allows for the fuel to flow a little bit faster. And you can see we had another clay layer here at about 250, 260 feet. And originally, before we started drilling and before we put this model together, we originally thought that there were a number of clay layers that the fuel had kind of stair-stepped its way down. So it ran down through a sandy layer, hit a clay, ran along the top of the clay, ran off the edge of the clay, through some sands, onto another clay. So we thought it kind of stair-stepped down. But based on our model, it really pretty much went straight down. So that was some interesting information that we didn't have before. So this image is looking from a map view, and this is where we're modeling the location of the impacts in the soil, not the groundwater, just the soil itself. And if you're looking down, you can see here's the source area, and as you would expect, there's still contaminants in the soil here in the source area. And then that source area moved down, kind of that long neck, and then kind of moved off a little bit more to the east. And so, but as you can see, it's all contained within the base boundary. We really didn't see any impacted soil above the water table off base. It was really all contained in the source area and next to the source area. This shows the groundwater impacts, and these red dots here are where we install our monitor wells. These are just the wells that were installed in our assessment. There's a bunch more wells out there, so we didn't show those because it would be hard to see. But what this shows is where the darker areas are the higher concentrations that we're seeing in the groundwater. And you can see that it's associated with the source area, and that's moved off base, but it really only kind of ends right around the parking lot of Bullhead Park. And the concentrations dropped off very quickly once we got past the base boundary. So it doesn't really go very much farther than this area here, and it doesn't extend past Ridgecrest. And these concentrations, keep in mind, this is benzene that we're looking at. So it's one constituent of the fuel. It's not EDB. But we were kind of, the benzene tends to be associated with the elnapple. So that's why we were tracking benzene. So this kind of gives a picture of how the napple interrelates with the soils and the water. And typically you just see you have little blobs of napple, Some of it can be sorbed onto the soil particles, basically just kind of stuck on there. And then you've got the water particles in between with, you even get some air in the pore spaces. So that's typically how the napple interacts with the soil and water. So some of the samples that we collected soil cores and we froze them and we sent them to a special lab in Houston. And at that lab in Houston, they took additional cores through those soil samples that we sent. And they did 2 tests on them. And we were trying to see, is the napple mobile? Like, will it move? And the one test was with a centrifuge where they spin it at about 25 times the force of gravity. And then they look to see, did any napple come out? The other one is where they'll actually drive water through the sample to see if they can push napple out. And so we ran both of those tests. Neither one of them indicated that there was any mobile napple, which is a good thing. So basically the mobile is stuck in the soil in a certain area and it's not moving. So using the data that we collected, we are trying to figure out, where is this non-mobile residual napple? Where is it located? Because it's going to be a continuing source of benzene into the groundwater. And so using something called effective solubility, which is essentially if you had fuel and you dropped it in water, it's going to dissolve into the water. So at that concentration right next to the fuel, what is that concentration that indicates about where that napple is? So we use that effective solubility concentration to basically contour where the napple is. And you can see this kind of lighter area here. That's where we're estimating where the napple is, and that lines up with what we're seeing in some of the monitoring wells, as well as what we're seeing in the soil samples that we collected. And so this light colored area is where we believe the L napple is. Again, it's trapped and immobile. And then this darker area on the outside, like a halo, that's the benzene, the dissolved benzene plume. And you can see that the dissolved benzene plume, it doesn't go north of ridgecrest, and it never has. And over the past, I don't know how many years, 8, 10, 15 years, the plume has really kind of been that shape. It's just kind of looked like this shape for a long time. And so that's indicative that not only is the napple not moving, but the dissolve phase isn't moving as well. So it's basically right here in this area. And that's helpful because we know this is the area that we need to address when we go to the corrective measures evaluation. So as I mentioned previously, we put together a computer model that gives us an idea of where are the contaminants in relationship to the soils and how are they moving through the soil or not. And when we built this model, we used the soil vapor data. So Scott had mentioned that we have a number of soil vapor points all within the BFF area and in the release area. It's like 90 different wells, and they're screened at from 25 feet all the way down to 450 feet. So we have hundreds of data points that we use to build this model with. And so that's the data that we used for the soil model, basically the Vado zone model. And we correlated that data with data that we collected during drilling, and it all correlated. And then for the groundwater model, we use that effective solubility model that I just showed you. And so one thing that's important to remember is that the model that we put together shows the state of the concentrations in the subsurface as they are today, okay, not historically, because there was some remedial attempts or remediation done, soil vapor extraction, and some other things that removed a significant amount of mass prior to our investigation. So probably when the release happened, it looked different than what we're seeing now, but this is what we're seeing today. So this is a plan view of the model put together. So this part here is the Vado zone, and this part here is what we're seeing in the groundwater. Again, the darker parts here are the higher concentrations of benzene, and you can see that things line up pretty well. You know, here's the source zone. Again, the constituents from the release migrated down through the subsurface. They impacted the groundwater table, and you can see, you know, here's about where the largest part of the, or the highest concentrations in the groundwater are, and that lines up with what we're seeing in the soil. So the data all seems to come together and make sense. And then this is a view of the model from the side. So again, you can see that the contaminants appear to really come straight down. They made their way through this clay zone here. You can see that over here. This model is looking from south to north. So this end here is like the south end of the plume, looking north, and then this is looking from east to west. So you're looking at it from the side. The base boundary, I think, is probably right about in here. And one of the things that we did was, and it's hard to see, but we put in layers of what the historical groundwater elevations were. So this was the 1958 groundwater elevation here, and that's about an estimate of about when the release happened. And then here is 1975, and then this is the current elevation, and then this one is 2009. So this was the deepest that the water table dropped before it started rising. And so you can kind of see here we have a bit of a smear zone because the fuel hit the water table, it dropped down to this 2009 level, and then it began to rise back up. And so you have fuel in interbedded pockets in that area, what we call a smear zone. So that tends to all make sense. So in summary, again, the fuel constituents based on our model appear to move a lot differently than what we originally expected. The soil impacts are contained on the base, and that's, again, the contaminants that are in the Vado zone. The NAPL does not indicate any mobility. It's basically staying where it is. Same thing with the dissolved phase plume. And the dissolved constituents are not moving north of Ridgecrest. They're pretty much just staying where they are. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Kate.
Thanks, Bernie. No, I don't. Regulatory stuff's kind of boring, and well, I don't think so, but there's nothing to really point at. So, you know, I had probably the highlight of my career at the open house this July, where one of our stakeholders said, well, what's the next step after this? You know, and we know you do this under your permit with the state of New Mexico. What do you do? I mean, there's got to be procedures, right? And so I gave him my quick 5-minute description of getting from where we're at now to the corrective measures evaluation, and he high-fived me. I should have retired right then. It was truly, for a RCRA nerd, it was the best day ever. But we have been getting more and more questions about this, and so I know, you know, it's like we get a lot of questions. Are you ever going to be done studying this? You know, is this part ever going to be done? When are you going to get to the corrective measures evaluation? And so what we're going to do tonight is talk a little bit about where we're at in terms of the investigation stage, and then in April, talk more about the next phase, which is the corrective measures evaluation phase, which gets to your question, Pete, as well. I'm not going to go through this slide in any detail. You can certainly read it. But one of the things to also keep in mind is all the field work we do and all the science that Bernie and Scott were sharing with you and we've shared with you in the past, all takes place within a pretty intense regulatory framework. It's not just the state of New Mexico we get permits from. We get permits from the state engineer's office. We get permits from EPA. We have rights of entry with the city. We have air permits from the city when we were running the soil vapor extraction. We have, oh, sorry, bring it down a little bit. We have permits, you know, coming out of permits. So everything has to be done in this framework in time to work well. And that makes it a little tricky, and I probably annoy the technical people with that. So where in the heck are we at in this mysterious RCRA process? And keep in mind, there's two parts of RCRA. There's the part of RCRA that deals with generation of hazardous waste and storage and treatment and disposal, and that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about what's called RCRA corrective action. And that's the part of RCRA that was passed in 1984 that says, hey, if you have an operating permit, we want you to go look for old releases on your site and address them under this permit to make sure that in the future we don't have more Superfund sites whenever Acme Electroplating closes their plant in the future, right? So that's what this law is for, and that's what we're doing. So we're not dealing with hazardous waste here. We're dealing with hazardous constituents in the fuel that were released from the failed infrastructure, the holes in the pipe. And those of you who have been to our plant, we have that piece of pipe up there and you've seen the hole in it. So I'll talk about where we're at in the investigation stage in a few minutes. But I want to stress, and Scott's talked about this too, because there seems to be a lot of misinformation out there in some ways about, you know, what does this interim measure we're doing mean? And are we going to just like shut it off? Well, as Scott demonstrated and showed the most recent data, it's working great. It's working just like we designed it. In fact, it's working a little more quickly than we hoped. So when you have a successful interim measure, there is absolutely no technical reason to shut it off. So in addition, we're regulated by the New Mexico Environment Department under our permit. So under this permit, we're doing this under this permit, and we cannot turn that off until we prove to the state we've met our cleanup standard in that target capture zone, which is the area north of Ridgecrest, where the groundwater contamination is just dissolved phase ethylene dibromide. It's not the other constituents like Bernie was talking about. It's just that one constituent. There was never a free product out there. There was never a pancake of fuel out there. There was just dissolved phase ethylene dibromate, above drinking water standards, but just EDB. So when the state finally says, hey, you've proved to me, Air Force, you've met the cleanup standards, then they'll say you can shut the treatment system off and the extraction wells, but we'll have to continue to monitor for at least 2 years, I suspect more than that, until we demonstrate to the state we've actually met the cleanup standards. So, to reiterate, we are not shutting off the pump and treat. One of the other things we're doing is think of about 4 different things in parallel. So we're running the pump and treat interim measure to get the EDB plume north of Ridgecrest. We're doing our regular quarterly monitoring that Scott talked about, where we have our 162 monitoring wells plus, you know, the new ones we have for the coring. We monitor those every quarter, and the soil vapor extraction wells, the soil vapor monitoring wells every other quarter. Then we do new investigation work. So the coring is an example of that. Some additional data gap wells we're going to be installing in the future are another example of that. So that's ongoing new investigation where any monitoring wells or soil vapor monitoring wells that are installed as part of those investigations goes into the quarterly monitoring, right? And then the last thing we're doing is pilots. So we're doing a couple of pilots. So Scott mentioned those, so we'll continue to do the passive monitoring stage of the in situ EDB pilot, which we really didn't talk about tonight. But remember, that's the one where we fed the treats, the nutrients, to the bacteria, and they decided that they like to eat the EDB. And we're in the passive monitoring phase of that. We did our last feeding phase a while back. But that's one of our pilots to help us figure out when we get to the corrective measures evaluation, if there's areas of hotspots of ethylene dibromide, is this a technology that we can use? And we'll evaluate it when it comes to that. We're also going to continue, as Scott mentioned, to do the bioventing pilot. And although that report is due to the state of New Mexico in January, we'll continue to probably do monitoring under that, and that information will then get folded into the corrective measures evaluation. We also, in the last year, have been pursuing a number of options, additional options for the treatment or for the management of our treated groundwater from our interim measure, the pump and treat. So as Scott mentioned, what is it, 775 million gallons? Something like that? Something like that. A heck of a lot of water, as we all know. And so what do we do with it? Well, what we currently do with it is we either water our on-base golf course, because they would have to pump water anyway, or use drinking water from our base to water the golf course, so they use our water. When there's issues with their infrastructure or the weather's cold and they don't need as much, we put it in permitted, what's called a Class 5 underground injection control well, and we put it back in the regional aquifer. That's my favorite way to do it, because we're a state in a drought, there's climate change. I like to put all this water back in the aquifer, but then I'm not a golfer. So, but you know, the golf course infrastructure breaks, and cold weather you can't water very much. We need to do some periodic maintenance and stuff on our current injection well. We had a valve failure last year and had to shut it down for a while. Because we want to operate this plant, as Scott said, 24/7, we need additional ways to deal with that water. So this year, we're doing 2 different things. One, we're going to install a second injection well. And we're in the process of getting the Office of State Engineer permit for that. The affidavit of publication for the OSE permit was published on the 18th of October, and the comment period ends on the 6th of December. This is done. We also have a permit from the state. Remember, I mentioned our UIC permit. It's called Discharge Permit DP 1839. And it allows us to install up to 4 more injection wells without a permit mod, but the state has to approve, the Groundwater Quality Bureau, the work plan and location of the well. And there's some other things we have to do to demonstrate that the well's in the right place and doing the right thing. So that's going to be another mechanism to manage our treated water. In addition, some of you were at the public meeting and public hearing that the US EPA had earlier this year on what's called our NPDES permit, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit. That's why we call it NPDES, because nobody wants to say the rest of that. It's a fancy way of saying an end-of-pipe discharge to a surface water. So what we want to do is a backup to the backup. Engineers like redundancy. We like factors of safety. So say both of our wells went down and the golf course broke. Where are we going to put that water till we fix those other things? Well, we're going to put it through the NPDES permit, which is going to be an outfall into Tejeras Arroyo. Now, we're talking about low flows. What is it, about 1.4 cubic feet per second? 2 cubic feet per second. 1.2 cubic feet per second. We're not talking about a gully washer. We're talking a little kind of, it's going to trickle down in there. And we got the permit from EPA, and EPA grants those permits instead of the state of New Mexico, because the state of New Mexico does not have primacy to issue permits under the Clean Water Act, like they do for the hazardous waste and RCRA. And so we got the permit, and it went into effect at the end of October this year. Now, of course, we're not monitoring under the permit because we don't have it built yet and we're not using it. So just to reiterate, this is our backup to our backup to our backup. But we made a commitment to the state, to the New Mexico Environment Department last year that we were going to put 2 more redundant means to manage this water so that we don't have to throttle back on the interim measure. More indication that we are not going to shut it off. We're putting all of these bells and whistles and redundancies in place to make sure that we can operate it uninterrupted. So why in the heck does this take so long? I mean, for someone like me who's been doing this for 35 years now and know it was not working in hazardous waste that turned my hair this color, I promise, it's just genetics. Why does it take so long? It doesn't seem in some ways like, particularly since 2015, when you could see the progress on this interim measure, that it's taking this long for most of the projects I've worked on. But as a member of this community and talking to people about it all the time, whether it's at the dog park or at the sports bar or the grocery store, I do understand how hard it is and how long it seems. So I hope that when you see the progress we've made on the interim measure and you can see that we pulled that plume back well away from anywhere near the municipal drinking water wells, and that we've done this coring study, which is going to help us inform the next phase of figuring out how to go after what's south of Ridgecrest, that you'll take confidence that we're not just studying this to death. We're doing this for a reason. We're doing it with an endpoint in mind with the help of the State Environment Department. But it's an iterative process. You know, you could set an arbitrary deadline and say, I want you to totally investigate this and have this cleaned up 5 years from now. Well, you know, unless, you have a brilliant Ouija board or you have x-ray vision and you can tell me exactly what's going to happen to this contamination and exactly what's going to work, great, tell me and we'll be done in 5 years. But you put these wells in phases, because if you just scattershot them, it doesn't tell you where the plume is. Look how unusual the shape of that EDB plume is in that narrow paleo channel. Scattershotting wells did not tell us that, right? It was interpretation of well-placed wells in iterative fashion and the work of sequence stratigraphers that helped us figure out where this was. That's what we needed to do. So it seems like it takes a long time, but you need to do it in phases because one phase informs the other and sets the deadline and schedule for the next phase. It's not arbitrary deadlines that force this project, it's science, it's the data in each prior phase that sets the stage for the next. The primary focus from about 2014 when we switched the project team and we heard the community, Charlie and among others, and we said, hey, okay, we hear you, you're right. And that's when, we're doing the SVE, that's when in 2015 is when we started the first extraction well, as Scott showed you. It's the one by the Christ United Methodist Church on Gibson. And we were doing this, and we were focusing, while we're still doing all our other monitoring and all that other kind of stuff, we focused most of our resources on getting those extraction wells in place, getting that treatment plant built, and getting a hold of this plume. But we always knew that we had to do the rest of it, right? In addition to all the general wells we had to do these cores. We had to figure out what was left of that residual fuel, that LNAPL that Bernie was talking about. What is left there? We had to figure that out. So this last year was the year of the core, right? A little bit until the year before and then this year. This is the year of characterizing what's left in the source area. And so this report that we submitted on Halloween, nobody let me draw pumpkins on it, but we submitted it on Halloween. And this is, it contains what Bernie was talking about and more. This, I think, is the last big key data gap that we had. And this is going to help us figure out how do we clean up what's south of Ridgecrest in the Vados zone and in the groundwater? What kind of technologies can we bring to bear to do this? We also had issues with the water table rise, and there's been questions about that. A couple years ago in 2017, early 2018, we come to you and talk about the data gap wells we put in because the water table went up. Why? The San Juan Chama diversion project, less pumping on the extraction wells like Scott was talking about. All of us, xeriscaping our yards, conserving our water, putting the bucket in the shower, doing all of those things, right? I do. And so all of a sudden the water table went up faster than it had been. And we had to replace some of those wells that were in key locations because now we know where things are, right? And we're looking mostly at that water table. All the ones with depth were okay, but we have to get that top of the water table because we want to know the gradient and we want to know the concentrations at the top of that water table. And so we did key work with the approval of the State Environment Department to figure out additional wells to put in to fill those data gaps. And so that's the kind of thing that can happen if you have an arbitrary deadline or you just think you're going to do this within a certain period of time and then the data changes on you, the conditions in the planet change on you, right, for good reasons. I mean, you look at any other state in the Southwest, city in the Southwest, we're so far above them in water management, all to the credit of the Water Utility Authority in this community. But it did change conditions, and we had to go out and put more wells, and you have to get at least a couple years of data out of them. That's not a delay. That's responding to changed conditions in the field. So with all of that, are we getting to the end of this thing? And, you can do projects like this, and back in the early days, from 84 maybe to about 2000, on all the projects I worked on, it was like just study. We never got to the end. And you don't want to do shortcuts and you don't want to get too little data, but you want the data to be focused and it's called results-based. If you look at EPA guidance from 2000 on, it's called results-based. And so what you do is you focus the investigation on what do you need to answer the technological questions that you get to the corrective measures evaluation phase, right? And so we're not going to study it to death. We're going to get the key points where we can tell the state we think we have enough to go to that next phase and start to look at remedy evaluation. I think the coring is probably that last key piece. I'm hoping the state and our stakeholders agree with me. So that's kind of where you start to see that transition. And I'm really hoping that we're getting close to there. So what needs to be done before we get to that final phase 2 RCRA facility investigation report? One, we need the phase 1 report that we submitted a while back approved, so we have direction to go to the next phase from the state. We need the state's approval of that source characterization report that we submitted on Halloween, the coring report that Bernie talked about. And then the state has to agree that we're ready, and they have to direct us to begin the RFI phase 2 report. And I've said this, and I want to say it again because sometimes there's just misinformation out there. When you switch from the end of the investigation into the CME, the corrective measures evaluation, it doesn't mean that you stop doing all these other things. It doesn't mean that you can't still do a targeted investigation because you're evaluating a potential technology and you go, ooh, I need this additional piece of data, and you go to the state and you do a work plan and you go get it. So there's not black and white cutoff lines. It's when you go from one main phase to the next main phase. So all during this time, we'll continue to do our quarterly monitoring. We'll continue to collect whatever data from the pilot test we're still obligated to collect. We will do all those things. We'll operate the pump and treat system for the EDB plume. So just because you go from one phase to the next isn't a bright black and white line. You get to do both at the same time, but you get to evaluate the remedies. So you can tell the regulatory part of this is what I really like. I made the mistake of going to law school, but then I didn't practice law, so I'm not all bad. No offense to the attorneys in the room, Charlie. So I'm hoping that in April you'll come and we'll talk about the CME. So before and there's a couple other points and then we'll open up for questions, but just to get to the question that you raised, Pete, about what about putting another extraction well in there. The interim measure was designed to address the dissolved phase EDB plume north of Ridgecrest because we were concerned at the direction that plume was going that it had the potential to eventually impact the municipal wells. An interim measure is done when you have a situation where there's either already an impacted drinking water supply or something like that, or there's a reasonable potential that it could happen. Because of the complexities of the situation and the data that Bernie was talking about, that's what the CME is for. You don't just kind of randomly put in another extraction well because it can actually make things worse. It can get fouled. It can change redox conditions. It can do all sorts of things. Pump and treat is actually not typically a favored option. I think we all get kind of lulled into a false sense of security about it here because it works so well on the EDB because it was the perfect application for something like this. But it doesn't mean it's a tool that fits every situation. And the corrective measures evaluation is where you carefully screen and you bring all the expertise, the engineering, the hydrologists, the modelers, the stratigraphers, the biologists, everybody together, and you figure out what's the best solution, and you propose it to the state, and then they pick. We don't pick, we recommend. But we don't have a direct threat. There's nothing, it's stable, and there's no reason to get ahead of the science. There's no reason to get ahead of that really good, comprehensive, thorough, interdisciplinary evaluation process. It works well, and that's where that comes into play. So I just wanted to shout, did anybody here go to our open house in July? Thank you so much. That was so much fun. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it to be a good experience. I know it's scary if you come in our regular gates and there's people with guns and batons and dogs and handcuffs and stuff, and you have to give your social, last part of your social and ID. And we let everybody in. We opened the gate at Ridgecrest at the end where New Day is, let you drive on base and come into the base and look at what we did. And we're hoping to do that again in July. We did get monsooned a bit, had to run everybody in the building because the tent started to flood. But it was so great because people got to ask questions at their own pace, see what we did, see the plant, come on base, get behind the wall, so to speak. So look forward. July, we should be having another open house. April will be a regular public meeting. And, you know, we've pretty much talked about all of this stuff already, so I won't go over it again, but if you want to refer back to it for what we've got coming up in the last little bit of this year and early next year. And then if you want to put it on your calendars to save the date, the next public meetings for 2020 are April 30th, July 24th, and November 5th. So with that, we'll open it up for questions, and please come to the microphone. Any particular one, are we good, or from a camera perspective, we're good? Okay. Scott, could you take this for get some water? Okay, thanks.
Oh.
The microphone's right here,
I'm hearing something. Yeah. May as
About
well
that?
try.
Here it is, sir. It's got a green light. I'm so sorry. You're almost dancing.
Hello, my name is Henry Miscible. I commute between the Boston area and Albuquerque. Some issues that I want to bring up. Number one, the NMED has indicated the extraction wells are not accident-free. In fact, there was a catfish that was stuck and they had to shut down the whole extraction process. I don't know for how long, but they had to shut it down. Yes. Number two, under the FOIA Act, Dave McCoy, probably one of the foremost environmental lawyers in the Southwest, he had to go to court to get the release of FOIA documents that the military withheld. 4 years of documents regarding the jet fuel spill cleanup. Number three, the budget that was approved, that was initially approved, it was $200 million. Currently, it's a $1 million budget. The question I would have is, is Kirtland Air Force Base planning to walk and just abandon the site, would be my question. Question number four, the injection wells. The military indicated, Kirtland indicated that they would place 6 injection wells. To my knowledge, there's only one that has been placed. And the other thing is, there is a pipeline that goes to the Tijeras Arroyo. What is that all about? And how much money has been allocated, budgeted for that? And lastly, under the RCRA program, the NMED, 3 plans have been rejected by the NMED because, and one of them, because Kirtland has withheld some of the documentation. So it all sounds so wonderful, and the cleanup is going according to plan, but the reality is different. And we as the citizens need to challenge the message that these people are giving, because it's not totally accurate. And the question I would have is, how much money is now being allocated for the cleanup? From the $200 million, my understanding is it's down to $1 million. That to me indicates, well, what is it?
We've spent to date $125 million, and we have another, I think it's $70 million allocated.
What about the 200 to 1 million that we're reading about?
It's not true.
Oh, really?
It's not true.
It is not true.
I signed the paperwork. I'm telling, it's not. I don't know
How much is being budgeted for the Tijeras Arroyo, for that pipeline?
200,000.
200,000.
That's how much it's going to cost, because the line already goes directly under the Arroyo, so we're tying into the existing pipeline and just kicking it right into there.
And can you explain why 3 of the RCRA documents that you filed were rejected by NMED? Explain that.
Well, without you specifying, one recent one was a work plan memo for some shallow soil vapor, and under the prior administration of the program, we were told to do it that way, and then when the Hazardous Waste Bureau took the project back over to put it under RCRA, which I'm totally supportive of, we had to take it back into a formal work plan. And so it was really more of a change in how things were done and institutional memory and going back to the permit format, which we were more than happy to do, than it was a rejection of the actual scope of work.
Well, there was a rejection, and why did you withhold one of the documents that they indicated was one of the reasons for rejection?
I'm not sure what you're referring to, sir, and without more detail, I'm sorry I can't answer your question. I really don't know what you mean.
It had to do generally with the cleanup. One of the documents was withheld. That's what they indicated. That's what the NMED site indicates.
Stephanie, do you know? Because I'm sorry, I don't.
I guess the general feeling I get is a feeling that this is a whitewash, that this is not accurate, that NMED is not meeting the deadline. They do not have a cleanup plan. It's an interim plan, and this has been going on for years. They've known about this for many years. And where are we now in 2019?
Sir?
We're still talking about this.
Yeah, I thank you. And you rattled off a bunch of other questions, and I might have lost track of some of them.
All right, I'm listening.
Okay, so.
Answer the catfish one?
No, I get to answer the catfish one because it's my favorite. No, here's.
Okay. So you were right about the cat. It shut it off for
I'm only right about the catfish.
one
What about
night.
the other
No,
issues?
we'll go to the other questions, but it was 1 or 2 nights, maybe it was 3. The system was shutting off, and so it goes to the golf course pond, and we have a high level alarm. So if the system gets too high, it doesn't just keep pumping and pump water out of the golf course pond. So it kept shutting off at like 3 in the morning, and our guys are like, "What's going on?" And then they would go out there, and it was like 5 feet high, the pond. It hadn't overflowed its banks. So they finally went out there, looked in, there's an area where there's a float, and there was a catfish from the golf course pond that had got in there, and he got stuck, and he kept setting the float off. So they went over to the bar and grill and got a hot dog, and then they fished the catfish out with a hot dog. And so we fixed this treatment system with the hot dog.
It does seem odd that a catfish could shut down the whole process, a multi-million-dollar process, and that the NMED indicated there were other accidents
We learn
as
new
well.
things every day.
Excuse me?
Well, we learned.
And
We
other
put
accidents.
grills around that so catfish can't get in it anymore.
Okay. What about withholding the RCRA documents for 4 years? Can you explain that?
I'm not aware of the lawsuit that you referenced, so if you could, my contact information is there, and if you could send me that, I'd be happy to respond, but I'm not aware of any FOIA litigation on this project since I've been on it for the last 5 years.
We have the documents. If you go to radfree.org, you can see the documents.
But I also want you to know that every document, every work plan, every report that we submit to the state is on our public website and is accessible through our administrative record, and they are all actually posted on the state's website as well.
Well, the NMED has not approved your plan, and you don't have a final plan. And right now, that's what you need to be working at, a final extraction plan. And this doesn't indicate that.
Sir, what I was just describing about going to the corrective measures evaluation phase is where that is done. And the interim measure is done in the same time as the investigation stage when you have to get ahead of the corrective measures. Because can you imagine if we had waited to all the completion of the investigation stage through the corrective measures evaluation report, through the hearing that's going to come, and then started to try to go after that EDB plume, the community and the Air Force would have both been unhappy, and that's why we went after it simultaneously with doing the investigation to set up the remedy evaluation. And so we actually got out ahead of it, not delaying it. And it's the state that, so the process I just got done describing is what we're required to do under our permit that's administered by the state.
Okay.
But we do have some other questions, sir.
The bacteria that is being used, how much money is being allocated for that process?
We're not. Sure. But
On the money? I just want to talk real quick on the money.
Okay. No, that's okay.
So, sir, just to answer your question on the budget, my previous job was at the Air Force Civil Engineer Center. I was the Deputy Director for Environmental. I worked for Miss Suzanne Bilbrey. What I will tell you is that BFF, any requirement, any money needed was always funded off the top. If they have a requirement, they got it. It was never a question. We knew the requirements, and we funded them. And I can tell you, we only have one SES. Of all of the 3,000 plus cleanup sites the Air Force has, we have one SES on one project, and she's standing right over there. Mm-hmm. She's 2 phone calls away from the Secretary of the Air Force. Mm-hmm. So if there is a requirement for funding, we get it on this project.
So what's the current amount being funded from the $200 million that was initially allocated?
Well, there's money that we had in the past, so it's 5-year money.
Mm-hmm.
So money that's funded in the past continue. So it's 5-year money. Mm-hmm. So money that's funded in the past, we continue to use some of that to do certain things. Just like you were to put a swimming pool at your house. Mm-hmm. You're going to spend a lot of money up front to put the swimming pool in. Then you're only going to spend a little bit to maintain your swimming pool, correct? Similar here. We've done a lot of the heavy lifting now. We've put in the extraction wells. We've put in a lot, treatment plant. We've done the monitoring wells. We have spent a lot of money right now. If there is a requirement for more money, we will get it.
So right now do we have the 6 extraction wells that you promised?
I'll pass that back to Ms. Lennon.
So when my boss, Assistant Deputy Secretary Mark Corral, came out here in 2014, he promised for the interim measure up to 8 extraction wells, if needed. You can see from the progress, and keep in mind that as in answering Pete's question, this interim measure only addresses the ethylene bromide plume only north of Ridgecrest. At the rate these 4 wells are working, there's not a technical need to install any additional extraction wells.
Why did you promise to install
Up-
6?
He said up to 8 if necessary.
And that was
Before we had all the data that we have now. So it was to make sure that there was
You
enough.
only have 1 installed.
Oh, you said extraction. Do you mean injection?
Injection, I'm sorry.
Actually, Mr. Krill never talked about any injection wells. So the injection wells came along later, a few years ago, actually, after I've been on board on the project. And our permit says we can have up to 5 if we need them. And so we have the 1. We're going to install the 2nd. But that's to manage the water. The 1 well can take all the water we have. And so the 2nd well is just to be redundant in case something happens with the first one and the golf course at the same time, or it's winter when we can't water the golf course very much. Additional injection wells beyond that would not be useful. There's no use for them. Based on the volume of water that we're generating from the treatment system and what the aquifer can take in the well that we have, there's no need for that. The 2nd well is just a redundant well to make sure that we always, when we have to rehab this well, repair valves, clean out biological growth that happens as you introduce oxygen when the water trickles in there. You have to clean them out every once in a while, or if for some reason the screen fails or something goes wrong, we have that 2nd well that we know is good and will work and is permitted. And then we'll take all of the water too. So
ultimately, you're planning for total extraction of the ethylene dibromide as well as the jet fuel spill, as well as the benzene type?
Well, no, we're not
contaminants?
proposing a pump and treat or anything at this point for the plume south of Ridgecrest. That's what's going to be done in the corrective measures
ultimate
evaluation.
extraction.
We don't know yet. We're going to do a technological evaluation, as I just discussed in my presentation. When we go to the corrective measures evaluation is where we go through all of that screening and we propose it. And if it turns out we think that's the best remedy and would work the best and achieve the permit conditions, we will recommend that to the New Mexico Environment Department. And then it's up to them to make the decision. Yeah, we agree with the Air Force, and no, we don't. And this is what we want you to do. We don't pick the remedy.
So you're not planning on abandoning the site?
Of course not.
Okay.
No, we all live here. I mean, I know that our leadership changes out every 2 years. Scott lives here. I live here. He lives here. We
Well,
drink the
heard
water.
different-
Our friends are here.
We've had different takes on this over the years.
Yeah, and we've heard them.
Right.
And
So
you're
it's
right.
hard to know where reality begins and ends.
No,
to be
and
honest.
we've heard them. You know, we live here. It's kind of odd being on the other side of rumors, but I will say the one thing, and Colonel Alvarez being here is, you know, with this kind of stuff, if we don't get it right, it undermines public trust in the larger Air Force. And I mean, I'm an environmental scientist. I was never in the military.
Well, public trust is a big question mark.
I know, and we have to
a big
do good
question
work.
mark.
So if we screw this up and we don't get it right, it undermines public trust, which means that, you know, senior leadership wants to make sure that we do the right thing. And so we've got the support of senior leadership, and we've had it left and right. So they've you know, we never get, you know, we said we want to have an open house. We want to open up the base gates to the general public to allow them to come on the base, and we want to do it here. And we gave them logistics, and they said, yeah, that's a great idea. We think it's a good idea.
I wish, my understanding is there was only 1 day notice for this meeting. They should have, you know, this should have been advertised way in the past. It was more than 1 day?
Yeah, it went out in a bunch of different.
Several weeks in advance of the
It was in the Albuquerque Journal yesterday.
Yeah, but we put a public notice as required several weeks
And
before.
big email lists.
And we have a big email list.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Stephanie, did you want to add anything in the response to that question before we go to the next question, or?
If you don't mind.
Do you mind, ma'am? Is that okay?
Sorry about that. I'll be short. So I just wanted to speak to the rejection, since you asked me to respond to that. So I'm familiar with the rejection that occurred since I've taken this position, and it's based on lack of documentation. It's the format that is required. It was a change in expectations from the original directive to switching over to the RCRA process. So the RCRA permit and the RCRA regulations have very specific requirements for what should be included in the work plan. And so the Hazardous Waste Bureau is holding the Air Force accountable to those requirements. And part of the historical knowledge of being transferred needs to be captured by that document. And so it's not rejected full out, it's rejected, but it'll be resubmitted with those comments addressed.
It was resubmitted, it'll be submitted tomorrow, I believe.
Right.
Tomorrow morning.
So we'll review it again to make sure it meets the standards that we're looking for with that expectation. For the other 3 rejections that you're referring to, I'd have to work with my staff to figure out why we did reject it, but it's not from withholding documents. The other piece I wanted to speak to was the corrective measures evaluation and final remedy. There's a huge public participation process. It goes to hearing. So the Hazardous Waste Bureau and the New Mexico Environment Department, we have to have a really solid case to be able to defend the decisions that we're making when it gets to that point. So we have to have solid data, we have to have solid documentation, and there will be plenty of opportunity for public involvement with choosing that final remedy and the final path forward. So thank you for letting me take that time.
Thank you for your patience.
De nada. So I have a question about why the measurements are being reported in concentrations, like the EDB, and not mass. As you've discussed, the table, the water table, that's dynamic, and so the volume is not constant. And so whenever there's a water table rise, you can have the same mass or quantity of EDB, but the concentration is going to be lower. So why is it being reported and what's being measured within the groundwater in why is that concentration instead of mass? And with regard to the vadose zone, when in the soil, sort of the same thing. I can imagine, I can easily picture a constant volume core because it's probably the same size. But if you're injecting, it also was alluded to earlier, as the moisture content of the soil is changing. And so now you're going to be injecting moisture, which I presume is water, into the soil. So there again, you're changing the picture, and even if the volume and the volume of the core is constant, if you've injected water, you can cause movement of EDB that may go outside of your core sample.
Great questions, and I might need some backup, Bernie, since I'm more of a regulatory jock. But when it comes to when you have, you're right. I mean, the mass is changing in the plume, and the mass is changing with time in both the EDB plume, and the concentrations can fluctuate as things come into the dissolved phase and stuff in the benzene plume south of Ridgecrest as well. But because it's very difficult to monitor that when you're 500 feet some underground and you're in the top 30 foot of the water table and you're kind of looking at all this, you have to do it kind of from discrete points and then kind of model and estimate what that concentration is in that plume, in that what we call kind of where you're looking at that elevation, because keep in mind we've got water table wells, we've got kind of mid-range wells, we've got deep wells, and all of this contamination is in the top water table part of the well. And so, it's not perfect, but like for instance, we estimate on a semi-annual basis when we do our plume capture modeling, we take all of our discrete data points, we look at what we've removed in terms of ethylene dibromide at the treatment plant, and we know how much we've removed because we know how much comes in and we know that nothing comes out. And we have estimates based on all those discrete points that are taken every quarter over multiple decades, right? We have decades of data. You're able to sort of, you're an estimate. Absolutely, it's an estimate, and it does change. But you're getting a pretty decent estimate of how the mass is changing in response to your pump and treat system, both in the plume because of both those discrete data points and what is being removed from the treatment plant. Is that relatively accurate? Okay, good, I'm getting a nod. When it comes to the vadose zone, it's a little more complicated too, because as Bernie was describing, just imagine down there, you've got stuff kind of sitting on the clay, you've got it in the sand, you've got it kind of going like this, and it's sort of sitting there, and we've run soil vapor extraction for like 12 years. And I don't know if you were at any prior public meetings where we talked about that, but we're just pulling this huge vacuum on this and taking a lot of the volatiles out. I think Scott mentioned about 750,000 gallon equivalents out of vapor in the vadose zone, doing it that way. So we've changed the condition that way. When we put a little bit of moisture and oxygen in there, yeah, we're changing it, moving around, but we measure the barometric pressure in our soil vapor points. We have soil vapor points at like 25, 50, 100, 154. We have them like at 6 different depths. So we're looking at that all across that system, and we monitor it at least twice a year. And we have wells all around where we're doing this to see how it's changing with that gentle blowing of the air and the little bit of moisture, to see what's going on both inside the area where we're doing it and on the perimeter of what we're doing it. But when it comes to when it's done, the way the state measures it, if you're done, is at those discrete individual data points. So that's, you know, if this was in a lab and you could kind of control it better and it wasn't underground, I think we could do what you're saying. But in the end, we have to demonstrate at every data point and say we have an adequate number of monitoring wells to the state that we've met the cleanup standard across that system. So is it, you know, absolutely perfect? No. Is it dealing with the real world situation that we have and how these projects are approached? Yes. Any other, oh, hi. Mr. Stromberg.
Okay, if you could go back to slide 6. Is anybody operating that? And I'm going to repeat my question because I'm not sure I heard what I was hoping to hear. If you look at the EDB zone off the base, there are no extraction wells on the base.
Correct.
And so the one that's right there on Ridgecrest would draw the EDB from the Bullhead base area north. And because if you look at quarter 2, 2015, the natural flow is in that direction. It seems logical, and I, first of all, congratulate you on the huge, you know, improvement of the situation, and the knowledge now that you have about the clay and the soils, that maybe you should consider an extraction well, either on the base or near the base boundary, to collapse the EDB plume that's closer to the source.
Well, there's a couple of issues there. One is when we, and I think, you know, you were at some of the meetings where we talked about this before. That extraction well that's there on Ridgecrest, right in Siesta Hills, they're kind of on the boundary, is, you know, that was designed to kind of cut off the base end of just the dissolved phase EDB plume. So that's when you look at that target capture zone, is that green boundary that goes there. And remember, there were a lot of discussions about people being concerned, and we were concerned, and the state was, and about bringing in some of the other constituents that are very stable, that are sitting there, that Bernie talked about, and sucking them into this well. It's not that our system couldn't treat them, but we didn't want to affect the stability of that other plume until we had a comprehensive, you know, strategy for remediating it. So that's why, you know, our intent of this interim measure was not really to address what we call the benzene plume, but it's really the one that contains everything, including EDB, south of the dissolved phase target capture zone for just ethylene dibromide that we've got here. And it's doing what it was designed to do. So we will evaluate things like that. I'm sure, you know, additional extraction wells farther onto the base as part of that corrective measures evaluation, but it will be done as part of that, where we look at all the ramifications. And remember also when I talked about all the permitting that we were doing, so if you look at our injection well permit and you look at our MPDS permit, they are limited to the effluent from just the dissolved phase EDB plume. We would have to change all of the permits too. So not that that's a big deal, not that you can't do it, but it's premature to do additional extraction wells. We don't need to expand on interim measures because there's not an ongoing threat. We have a lot of good data. We think we're getting close. And the corrective measures evaluation, as Stephanie said, it not only has a robust public participation component, but it's where you bring all the science to bear to have a comprehensive integrated remedy. I've been on sites where you take a stable plume like this, you put an extraction well, you change the conditions down there, you mobilize the plume, the well clogs up in a month, you've got a maintenance nightmare, it doesn't work. And you pump and treat forever because there's source terms still out there. And here, the reason this is working so well, we had one constituent, relatively low concentrations, confined shape. There was never any source term out there. Remember, all the soil contamination in the vadose zone is on the base pretty much, right? It's on the base now. And the surface soil contamination is long gone. We dug it up, a long time ago. It was just around the fueling area. So this is a very discrete, isolated situation where there's not stuff in the soil to come back into solution after you shut it off and all this stuff. So it's like a perfect application of a pump and treat. But expanding it into situations where it's not as well suited maybe takes a very thorough evaluation that I think deserves to have that, deserves to be vetted by the state, deserves to be vetted through the public comment and probably the public hearing process. I'm sure Mr. McCoy will ask for a hearing, and we will have a hearing. And that's, that's when that'll be discussed.
Okay, so does NMED expect you not to clean up EDB that's off the base? That's what you're saying you're not going to do.
No, I'm saying we're cleaning up the ethylene dibromide that's north of Ridgecrest. That's what the interim measures.
I'm saying all the way to the base boundary.
You said north.
South of Ridgecrest.
Okay, now you said south. You misspoke.
All the way to the base boundary. No, I said off the base.
Okay. Oh, I see what you're saying.
Ridgecrest is not the base boundary.
Right. No, okay, I'm sorry. It's been a long day. I was up at 4 o'clock this morning. Mom had a stroke last night. So anyway, we consider south of Ridgecrest to be the combined other plume that we will address in the corrective measures evaluation. Yes, we will address it. It's just that will be done not as an interim measure, not through an expansion of the current extraction well system. It will be done through the thorough two-stage screening process and thorough scientific evaluation that happens in the corrective measures evaluation process. And yes, we will address this plume.
And you expect that to be within your current funding?
Yes. And then once we have the hearing, and then what happens, we'll just talk about it in April. We submit the RFI Phase 2 report. NMED reviews it and said, it's approved, yay. Do the corrective measures evaluation. Air Force says, cool, we do the corrective measures evaluation. And it's kind of a two-stage screening process where you look at all these technologies, you kick out the ones that are really dumb and won't work, and then you do thorough evaluations of the ones that have potential, and then we make recommendations. Here's what we want to do for the Vado zone. Here's what we want to do for that plume south of Ridgecrest. We want to continue to do the pump and treat north of Ridgecrest. This is what we want to do, NMED. We give it to NMED. They review it and they say, okay, we agree with that pump and treat north of Ridgecrest, but we'd like you to do this and this a little differently for the Vado zone. So our chosen remedies are X, Y, and Z. They put out what's called a statement of basis, I won't use the acronym, and a fact sheet. They put it out for public comment. Now people can submit public comment on the record, they will do a written response to comment, or you can request a public hearing. I'm sure someone will, it will be granted. That is a very robust public participation process. I've been in these hearings before. Even members of the public, hearing officers here, allow them to ask questions of technical experts on the stand. NMEDs, ours, Water Utility Authority, doesn't matter. Then at the end of it, the hearing officer report comes out, makes their recommendations. The state takes it and says, this is what we agree to, here's what we do, here's the final remedy. If people want to take it to court, they can or not. They direct us to do the corrective measures implementation plan, which is you design, build, do it, and we will go forth and do it. And that's it in a nutshell.
So that report goes to NMED when? And you're
Well,
talking about that
they
in
have to
April?
direct us, and this is what I was just talking about in my presentation. So they have to approve the Phase 1 plan, they have to approve the coring report, they have to agree that we've got enough to go to the next phase, direct us to write the Phase 2. They have, about 180 days to review it once we get it, or something like that. And then if they approve it, and then they can direct us. So there's regulatory deadlines of review times and stuff for the state that are built right into their rules. So we're hoping to get at least towards the CME, if not turned in by 2021, not too long after that if we all put the pedal to the metal, but that takes quick turnaround times on the state's part, our part, everybody's part. And then it will go out for that public participation process. But look at the slides, I did lay it out. And the time frames, they're long.
Okay.
But that's why, but that's precisely why we did the interim measure. So it's, you can look at the glasses half full or you can look at the glasses half empty. When there's a potential threat like this, I can tell you in the private sector, you would have been really hard pressed to get Acme Manufacturing to spend this money because it would have been a long time if it ever hit the Water Utility Authority wells. We did it while we're still in the investigation phase, and it's working really well, and it's protecting our community's water supply. And so, yes, this takes a while, but we did the right thing and it's working. and we're following the process. And I know it's frustrating and I know it's long, but it really does work. And the public has a very robust participation process on the record under law in a hearing on this. So I know it's frustrating. I'm used to it because I've done it for a long time. But this is why we did it in advance, because this isn't fast. We went after this because we knew it would take a long time to get to that final remedy, and no one wanted us to wait, and we agreed with that.
I just want to make sure it's continued.
Absolutely. I
Thank you
still
very
drink
much.
the water here. In fact, it's in that bottle somewhere. Hi, Diane. Oh, sorry. I'll give you the mic back.
Hi, Diane Agnew with the Water Authority. I just wanted to make a point of clarification. In your presentation, you indicated that the Ridgecrest well field is not currently pumping. It is currently pumping. The only thing that's changing in our operations is that we don't pump as much groundwater because we're using surface water. So there's no change in how we're operating our wells and delivering our water to you. We sample all those wells monthly. We make sure that we don't see any detections, and we also track the USGS Sentinel wells to make sure we don't see any indication that things are moving towards our wells. So, but they are pumping.
Thanks, Diane. I actually caught that, and I meant to correct it, and thank you very much for doing that, because I forgot. Any other questions? No? Bye, Bill. Bye, Alex. Bye, Greg. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you so much for coming out. And our contact information is on the last page of the handout. Oh, sure.
And so, and I've said it before, I know a lot of you have been here. If, you've got our contact info on the very back slide. If, you're thinking about this later and you want to come out to the base and you want to check out the treatment system, just call, I'll make it happen. I'll pick you up at the base gate, I don't mind. We had the open house. I think getting in the room really changes people's perspectives, and if you guys care enough to come out on a Thursday night, it's cold, it may rain, then we care enough to show you around and let you see the treatment system. So doors open. Just want to let you know. Thank you.
Thank you, and get home safe.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Have a good night.